How's it going? One more time. How's it going? There we go. That's good. I'm going to talk a little bit about masculinity and gender. I'm an academic, so a lot of this stuff will be academic, but I also have a series of images that are supposed to be provocations. Some of them are literal, some of them are juxtapositions, so I'm going to ask you to do a little work today too, just a little, just a little. First provocation, who's this? Daft Punk. This is a French duo who make electronic dance music. And I'm starting with them because they have an interesting origin myth. They produced records in the 90s, but on New Year's Eve 1999, they had an explosion in their studio. And after the explosion, they were put back together, half robot, half man. And so they only appear in these masks and also with gloves whenever they're in public. And so the question there is, I think they still read as men, but during the explosion, did their dicks blow off too? Does that make them men if they have the dick, or if it's gone, are they still men? So what are the signifiers that tell you someone is male or masculine? So I'm going to look into that today. The modus here is it's not a really standard lecture or a talk, like I said, so I'm going to sort of wind through it. It may seem a little disjointed, that's on purpose. It's so that you do some work too, so this is a bit of a haptic experience, it's supposed to be at least. So what's with the title? I imagine you guys have seen Lethal Weapon, yes? Before Mel Gibson went crazy, right? The title is Watch Your Ass, and it's a line in the movie, and Mel Gibson says it to Danny Glover, you know, watch your ass. And I think that's provocative in itself because it is a buddy movie, it's a buddy cop film, and they look out for each other and they take care of each other. And at the end of the second movie, Mel Gibson's character is riddled with bullets and he's on the edge of death. And Danny Glover is kind of cradling him. And Mel Gibson looks up at him and says, give us a kiss. So I think there's this interesting homosocial bond that plays out in these movies that an otherwise ostensibly, you know, sort of uber masculine macho set of guys actually have this sort of homosocial bond that is, even if it's subconscious or under the radar, I think it's still very present. It also, to a certain extent, refers to third-person adventure games because you spend most of the game actually looking at the backside of the player. So if you're a male and it's a male character, you're actually engaging in a kind of gazing at the male body, in particular the backside of the male body. And so that sort of dredges up a kind of homoerotics as well. So I think there are things going on underneath this that are worth exploring. Theories of masculinity. Generally speaking, the field is still maintained or policed through the binary of nature versus nurture. So nature being the body and the biological determinism. And the SRY gene, excuse me, on the Y chromosome is what codes a male as male. It's what makes the testes develop. It's responsible for the hormones that you deal with throughout your life. And so the concept with nature is, or the idea behind nature is that masculinity comes from the body. It's a literalized part. And so that sexuality is also a part of that body. The other side, nurture, this is really about the sociology of the male, but also how culture sort of bends and molds that male, or whatever kind of male you are. So aspects that are considered natural are linguistically or culturally driven. At the core of all culture and cultural studies is language. So you'll see me go back to language quite a few times, and I want you to think about language in terms of everyday sort of, you know, conversations that you have with other people. You read the body as signifying a certain way, and it has certain things that are coded, whether it's clothing or hair or the presence of breasts or the presence of a penis. And so all of this stuff sort of leads to the acculturation of maleness. Masculinity doesn't have a central cause or source. That's an important point. It is both nature and nurture. I tend to fall to the side of acculturation. I think it's a more significant force in the development of the male. I think it's also space for more radical interpretations of masculinity as well. And so second provocation, who's this? Grand Theft Auto, anyone? CJ? This is the central character. And so I want to point out here that this is a kind of black masculinity, or in this case, African-American masculinity, and that there are very large differences when it comes to ethnicity, to nationality, to location, to geography. And so when I'm talking about men today, I am talking about various races, but in general, they do code very differently, so I want to make sure that that distinction is made. Pretty consistently, most scholars, when they talk about masculinity, there's an implied critique of what's known as hegemonic masculinity, or the hegemony, the ruling sort of set of ideas of culture. The concept there are a set of rules that men must adopt and that women must eschew or face penalty or violence. And this is a quote from Connell, and Connell is really the sort of guiding force behind masculinity studies. He started writing in the late 80s and early 90s, and so we think of him as the kind of godfather, or the one that really got things rolling. So it would be, I would be remiss if I didn't have some Connell in this talk, and I do have a little bit more than this. Hegemonic masculinity can be defined as the configuration of gender practice which embodies the currently accepted answer to the problem of the legitimacy of patriarchy, which guarantees the dominant position of men and the subordination of women. Generally speaking, it varies culture to culture, but there are rules that go with masculinity, and these are policed not only by men, but larger social forces like schools, the courts, etc. And some of the basic rules that you see across cultures, both in the global north and the global south, is that you constantly have to prove yourself. And the men in the audience, I think, know intrinsically what I'm talking about, whether it's through sports or whether it's through some kind of creative output, or whether it's through sex or sexual contests. The constant proving is a central feature of masculinity. Second is be strong and silent. The over-talkative male is the feminized male, the stereotypical feminized male. And so silence lends itself to the kind of the sturdiness that is expected. Never let them see you sweat. So showing stress or any kind of anxiety or fear is again pushed towards the feminine realm, and so that's policed. You're supposed to be constantly calm and in control. You need to separate yourself from the pack. This is particularly true for industrialized, capitalized countries and nations. Individualism is a way and a means of establishing what kind of masculinity you're supposed to eschew, or at least, promote, or at least identify yourself as different from other males. And that again goes back to proving or the competitive nature of masculinity. Disavow any real relationship to other men. You can have male friends, but there's a line that never must be crossed, and that's where homophobia comes in, or the fear of intimacy with another man. And so there's always an arm's length that is expected out of the stereotypical male. Another provocation. This is a very particular American masculinity. It's really the sort of gunslinger that comes from the Old West, although this game isn't set there, it's set in the same time period. And this is a lot like Clint Eastwood. This is a loner. This is someone who is strong in silence, sticks to himself, stays away from community, and in effect can go it alone. And that's kind of part of his charm, or at least his allure. Another provocation. Make a game where nobody has insides, and make the outsides a constantly morphing reflection of other bodies in the game world. If you think about gender in terms of insides and outsides, decoupling it, you do have an opportunity as designers to think through this through praxis. Generally speaking, when we talk about masculinity in relationship to video games particularly, we talk about violence. And this is from Michael Kimmel and Kaufman, and they basically created a triad to understand how violence works amongst men. And there's, of course, violence between men, violence between men and women, and then men's violence against themselves, which takes usually the form of risk, or if you can think of X Games or any kind of extra dangerous activity. These three kinds of violence do overlap. They change, they dissipate, and they increase depending on various forces at work in the culture. So they're always at work, usually never singular. How is masculinity thought? Again, this is from Connell. These are 4 different approaches to conceiving of how men think of themselves, but also how men are thought of. And so this is a little bit of theory here. The first is essentialist, considering the body as an essential whole being with a center, with a core, with a unique individuality. Men are men because of sex gender. The one feature theory, and that one feature is usually the penis. That is the defining element. Positivist, men are men because they are men. And this sort of goes back to what men actually are. And so it's sort of a self-defining, circular concept of how men think of themselves constantly. Normative, men should act like men, and so this is the surveilling or the policing of masculinity done by other men, but also institutions and women. And then the semiotic, which of course, semiotics is the study of signs and symbols. So we're talking about language here to a certain extent. Men are defined by what they are not. Men are men because they are not women. And so this has an othering effect, and this is largely responsible for the binarism that we continually manufacture and uphold when we think about genders. We can also think about masculinity as a type of technology itself, and gender as a type of technology. It's a set of rules and practices that are largely codified by the culture. It is progressive in that it changes constantly, and there's the concept that you're supposed to level up constantly as a male, always get better, always be smarter, faster, stronger. So technology is an imaginary and a real space where masculinity and men are both imploded and exploded. And I want to bring up Heidegger's notions of poiesis and techne. This is from Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher. These 2 words are at the core of the impulse behind technology. So it is what technology is, and it's also why we do technology and how we use technology. Poiesis is more akin to the craftsman. And so if you can imagine a block of granite, the sculptor looks at the block of granite, and working with the material, there's a becoming that happens. And sort of, so the statue itself will reveal itself through the actual practice. Techne is quite different. This is the more standardized, industrialized sense of technology that tends to look at that block of granite or a tree or any kind of natural resource out in the world as what Heidegger calls a standing reserve. And so this means that there are constantly materials out there that we are expected through technological means to change and use for our own purposes. And so if you can think about environmental degradation or a lack of respect for nature and for our other companion species, techne is at the heart of that. So considering the world as a standing reserve obviously has negative connotations. With poiesis, I think there is a positivity at the core of it. Play a game against yourself where you are the protagonist and the antagonist. See who wins. This is referring to the split subject. This is the postmodern subject. This is how identity is theorized now in the academy, generally speaking. You have a series of roles that you play, and those roles are interchangeable. And they often change in relationship to who you're actually talking to. So here we have a elision in a kind of slipperiness to gender, not solely for masculinity. When I use gender as a prism to look at culture and video games in particular, I tend to use the concept of performativity or the dramaturgical. I see masculinity as inherently performative. It's something that we're constantly performing all the time. And it can be exhausting, it can be confusing, but conceiving of masculinity this way opens up possibilities for men to be different kinds of men all the time. And so there's a potentially negative opportunism here, but also there's a potential positive sort of, an open space where you can try on different roles. So this is akin to what Heidi was talking about yesterday. Where's Heidi? Hi. When you were talking about identity tourism. This is linked, I think, to a certain extent. So in many senses, we express gender as a series of masks or costumes. I also, in my book, Die Trying, Masculinity, Video Games, and Culture, I put forward a notion, a very particular notion that happens to be in accord with the way we play video games, but also the way we make video games, which is Boyhood. And Boyhood is essentially a regressive state that's available to any of us that tinker with any kind of technology. And this boyhood is something that you can maintain over the course of your life, and it's quite regressive psychologically. And it's also a place where you are technically free from responsibility, so it's a place where you can kind of get away with anything. And so this should dredge up statements like boys will be boys, nothing you can do about it. Oh, he'll never grow up. And this can be seen as a benefit for many men and for women, the women that are involved with them or the men that are involved with them. But I mark it as something that's ethically and morally compromised and challenging, to say the least. Also, we tend to perform our gender roles by mimicking other available privileged texts or bodies. And so we could think here of the Hollywood cult of the star and choose your favorite notion of masculinity. We all have someone that we model ourselves after, and so part of this performance is choosing the role and trying to fit yourself into that role, maybe already created by another male. Where was this made? Yeah, there you go. That's for everybody. Some of the current research that I'm doing, I'm looking at younger children and trying to figure out differences in how children actually play, not just with video games, but with blocks, with any kind of sporting environment. And there are some very clear differences, and this happens to be true across ethnicities and across sexual preference as much as you can determine that in children this young. Boys tend to favor rules that are inflexible, and because the rules are inflexible, that actually ensures a kind of fairness. Whereas females are quite different. They want the rules to be flexible, and that actually promotes fairness. So there's a sense when girls are playing, if they come to a stopping point or a roadblock, they'll bend the rules so that everybody can continue playing. But they think of that as inherently fair. So there's a sense of improvisation present in girls' play that boys don't quite get to. Girls do favor cooperative work. Boys are equally happy to play alone, and girls tend to steer away from violent content, and boys tend to steer towards it. This was a large group of people that I studied. So some of these are mild generalizations, but the question here really is, again, nature-nurture. How much of this at the ages of 3 to about 7, how much has already been learned and taught to you? And is there a way to sort of act against that? And in groups, they tend to be, as females tend to be a little bit more flexible about thinking about how they've been taught to be females, whereas boys constantly police their own behavior and the behavior of others. This word was used a bit yesterday, and so I did want to bring up the baggage that goes along with it, the historical baggage. The term homosexuality is a word that was invented in the 19th century by very early what we would now call psychologists, or those that study the human mind and development. Invented in the 19th century in order to clinically describe what they saw as the perversion of male-male sexuality. Homosexuality wasn't applied to female-female sexuality until the 1920s and 1930s. So this carries a lot of baggage with it, and I wanted to point that out so that we're all a little careful and get a little more comfortable with the verbiage that the community tends to use on their own, which is lesbian and gay are very acceptable, and in fact they're preferred by most of the people that I know and most of the literature that I've read. And people do tend to stay away from the term homosexual. This is a sex robot made in Japan. Build a game so that if the player doesn't pass as the opposite gender, they get gay bashed. I was talking a bit with Adam yesterday. Is Adam here? We were talking about, I have a student that I'm working with that is transgender, and he is working on a game where the potential outcome is that you're constantly shifting gender, but you're policed by the NPCs, and they will harm you if you don't pass, and this is the term that the transgender community tends to use, which is passing for either male or female, avoiding violence, but also finding a home within a specific community. Also, I wanted to bring up the term queer. Queer is, it's actually been reclaimed as a very positive term, particularly in the US. And it's good because it's an umbrella term. It describes a wide range of behaviors, attitudes, and identities. Its positively lies in an umbrella effect that questions notions of heteronormativity and straightness/narrowness. Straightness is an identification. It's also a form of sexuality. Narrowness is more akin to homophobia or the non-acceptance of difference, non-acceptance of difference. I want to bring up three really excellent theorists. Judith Butler, Catherine Hales, Donna Haraway. Judith Butler's at UC Berkeley. Donna is at UC Santa Cruz, and Catherine used to be at UCLA, so we almost had a full UC trifecta there. Seeing as that's my university system, I'm very proud of that. The first I'd like to talk about is Judith Butler. She is known as a queer feminist political theorist. She thinks about the body, she thinks about gender, she thinks about sexuality. And she is particularly critical of what she calls compulsory heterosexual normativity, or the way straightness is supposed to be acted and behaved in a variety of communities. Gender assignment is a means of sustaining the ruling political binary, so she's not just talking about the bodies, but she's talking about the bodies as extensions of the discourse of power at the highest levels and at the most local levels. She puts an emphasis on the body as vulnerable, as unintelligible, as unknowable, and unrepresentable. And if you can think of someone who is queer or someone who is going through sex alteration, this unintelligible or unpresentableness is actually a site of power. It allows for different kinds of behaviors and different kinds of movement. And so she tends to argue for this as a means of, it's a kind of liberation. Resistance to normativity takes on the form of body drift. And this is queering bodies, ideology, politics, and gender. And so body drift is when you as a body and as an identity drift outside of the normative range. And again, she finds this as a positive, as a place for exploration. Catherine Hales really works a little bit closer to computer science and video games, per se. The human as we know it has been transformed by what she calls the regime of computation. So that's everything from Facebook to games to word processing. She is a scholar of literature, so she tends to focus on how texts have changed over the past 30, 40 years. The body is being remade at the border of materiality and simulation. So every time we log on, no matter if it's a video game or if it's Facebook or it's Twitter, part of our body goes away or it is transmitted somewhere else. And so that kind of, again, body drift, she finds to be, it's positive, it's something that can be engaging and compelling. And the arrival of this regime of computation has resulted in the post-human. And the post-human, she thinks of potentially someday we will be post-gender. We'll be post-sexuality, post-identity, post-consciousness. So we'll actually live a different way in relationship to our machines. And this is a friend of mine who started out life as a male, underwent sexual assignment surgery and reassignment surgery, and now passes quite well. But on some days, any given day, she will wear clothes typically attributed to men, and she'll pass as well. So she lives a very in-between life, and to her that's very exciting and potentially positivistic at least. Hales, this is from Arthur Croker. He's written a really great book that actually talks about Butler, Hales, and Haraway, and it's called Body Drift, hence the short quote in the previous slide. Rejecting the perspective of technological determinism as much as the celebration of technology as a religious singularity, Hales' cultural achievement lies in suggesting a critical perspective on technology in which the human species limits itself to that of a co-evolving partner in the relationship, and against the technical will to disembodiment and immateriality, that human subjectivity recover the possibility of embodied consciousness. So she really sees digitization as something that will change the body. It just depends on how we conceive of that relationship and that progress. Who knows where we'll end up? She thinks there will be a sort of hybridity. Donna Haraway is very famous for writing the Cyborg Manifesto. It's almost 35 years old. It was a very important essay for feminist theory, for queer studies, and for masculinity, because she conceived of the cyborg as this new figuration of the body. And she was pursuing ways to rethink gender through the mixing of machine and body. So if Butler is about contingency and Hales is about complexity, Haraway is about hybridity. So it's mixing the two, literally in the space of the body. So replacing it, upgrading it. And so if the post-human is very prevalent in her and Hale's work. This is the intersection of humans, plants, animals, and minerals, coupled with the complexities of female bodies. So again, these are sites of resistance. These are sites of struggle, but also sites of possibility. And her latest work focuses on humans as companion species, and companion species to all of the animal and plant life on the planet. So she was from Santa Cruz, so there's still a little bit of a hippie hangover there from the 60s. But she sees, again, that we need to sort of degrade our hierarchical status in the world of living things and start to think of ourselves as companion species. So along the same lines of respecting all animals and plant life as if it had the same kind of subjectivity as humans. We typically tend to push objectivity onto other things that aren't human, and she wants to sort of break that up. This is this very famous photograph from the Dust Bowl, which was during the 1930s in the US, which was a major economic crisis, but also a moment where women and children were at a very particular kind of crisis. And this is from Haraway. The perfection of the full, defended, victorious self is a chilling fantasy, linking phagocytotic, amoeba, and moon-voyaging man cannibalizing the earth in an evolutionary teleology of post-apocalypse extraterrestrialism. It is a chilling fantasy whether located in the abstract space of national discourse or in the equally abstract spaces of our interior bodies. So again, if you notice power and how the human body stores, fights against, resists power, this is a thread that runs through each of these three theorists. Some of my current work involves a game called America's Army. Anyone play this? Yeah, okay. It's been around for about 8 years, and I started out studying. I met a group of players, and I joined their group, and I told them who I was and what I was interested in talking to them about. And this was about 6 or 7 years ago. And I started out with 10 men, and I was interested in what they thought of the game, if they thought it was potentially a recruitment strategy, since the game itself, it was designed and is maintained by the US military. And so I was interested in it as almost a sociological experiment to see if that I could play into their world and learn at a different level. Out of those 10, 4 did end up enlisting. All 4 came back. It was about a year and a half ago. 2 have committed suicide because the post-traumatic stress disorder was too great for them to bear, and also because the US government is doing a really shitty job of taking care of our veterans. So it is, the project has taken on a really sort of monumentalism about it. And what's fascinating particularly about this game is that it's very, very branded. You can buy action figures. Those are aimed obviously directly at kids. You can take your family to visit the Traveling Roadshow, which is America's Army. You can sit in a Humvee and use almost perfectly realistic guns. They don't shoot, they obviously shoot lasers. You can also go online, play the game yourself, and you can also talk to actual vets when you're there and ask them about their experience in the military in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever they're posted. The US Department of Defense estimates this is crucial, they estimate this because rape is a sorely underreported crime. Estimates that 26,000 sexual assaults occurred in the military in 2012. If that matches the rubric of rape outside of the military, generally underreporting accounts for about 60% of rapes. So we could think of that number as probably closer to 50,000, maybe even 55,000. These are overwhelmingly perpetrated by men against women, although the men do rape men in the armed forces as well. In 2012, only 1,108 have filed for an investigation. That's because the commanding officer usually quashes it and said this didn't happen. You're imagining it, and you're being a hysterical female as usual. 575 of those cases were actually processed, and only 96 went to court-martial where some kind of action was taken against the perpetrator. Another provocation. This is what's known as a Clovis point, or a Clovis tip. This is about 12,000 years old. Significant about this is that it's essentially a spearhead or an arrowhead, but this was fashioned with tools. And so we can see the beginnings of technology are always interwoven with violence and with war. Okay, long quotation here. Sorry. In the Cyborg Manifesto, so this is Haraway writing about her earlier work, this is a more recent. I tried to write a surrogacy agreement, a trope, a figure for living within and honoring the skills and practices of contemporary technoculture without losing touch with the permanent war apparatus of the non-optional post-nuclear world and its transcendent, very materialist lies. And when she dredges up the term materialist, she is a Marxist feminist, so she's using it in terms of materialism, not the kind of consumerism that is the more popularization of the word. Cyborgs can be figures for living within contradictions, attentive to the nature cultures of mundane practices, the everyday, attentive to the dire myths of self-birthing, embracing mortality as the condition for life, and alert to the emergent historical hybridities actually populating the world at all its contingent scales. However, cyborg figurations, and again, she is writing many years after she published the manifesto, cyborg figurations hardly exhaust the tropic work required for ontological choreography in technoscience. So ontological refers to states of being. So it's the way that you navigate your beingness and your identity as an extension. I have come to see cyborgs as junior siblings in the much bigger queer family of companion species in which reproductive biotechnopolitics are generally a surprise, sometimes a nice surprise. Coming soon. There's a double entendre there, right? This is from my book. In the same way that performance and the performance of gender signifies a complex field of interconnected signs and symbols, so too does interactive software within its own representational field and within the media matrix that includes it in the machines of capital. This is perhaps why it is so important to carefully critique and study this medium. Like other digital technologies, interactive software forms a particularly seamless unification with other modes of production in support of dominant ideologies and the forces that seek to cover up and or exploit the marginalized and the underrepresented. This is performance artist Carolee Schneemann. The piece is called Internal Scroll. She very slowly pulls a long, thin piece of paper out of her vagina, and on it she has scrawled a type of feminist manifesto, and she slowly reads it as it comes out of her. State-sanctioned violence is the product of a culture where domestic violence is normalized against the backdrop of representational violence, of which video games are often a part. In overwhelming numbers, women are the victims of domestic violence and therefore ideological violence. But games are just for fun. Boys will be boys. So a central assertion, putting all of this stuff together, is that game structure and haptic architecture emphasizes and interpolates certain behaviors in the player.
These mimic subject formation within the cycles of media signification, commodity capitalism, and postmodern culture. So in this sense, games function as an ideological machine that manufactures an ideal subject position. And this has to do, again, with Boyhood. But in a larger case, the transcendent male, the male that is always on top of things. That's another double entendre. This reflects heteronormativity. It's an implied rejection of other forms of masculinity and sexuality, so gayness. This situation is inherently performative and self-reflexive, and the cutoff is the positionality is inherently dominating and subjugating. On a slightly more positive note, there are myriad ways to think about gender, particularly about the gender binary, and to sort of undo it actively, not only with your brain, but also with your behavior. And if you know music, you know a little bit about tonality and how tones work. In functional tonality, each triad has a tonal function in relation to the tonic triad, so 3 keys, always working together, and with other triads in the key. So if you can think about these keys as a triad, you can think about femaleness, queerness, and maleness, so that not one of the notes is more important than the other. They function together, and they function potentially in harmony. But also, they can be dissonant. This is a very strange quotation from 2 very strange writers. Let's just dive in. This is how it should be done. Lodge yourself on a stratum, experiment with the opportunities it offers, find an advantageous place on it, find potential movements of deterritorialization, possible lines of flight, experience them, produce flow conjunctions here and there, try out continua of intensities, segment by segment, have a small plot of new land at all times. It is through a meticulous relation with the strata that one succeeds in freeing lines of flight, causing conjugated flows to pass and escape, and bringing forth continuous intensities for a body without organs. And so this thread draws back to Daft Punk and what kind of body and what kind of organs they still have, even if the origin myth is a myth. Male or female? I have an assignment for everybody. It's a fabulous book. Has anyone seen this or read this? It's fabulous. It's complicated. It's a definitive critique of how violence and power work in games, but also how the market functions in relationship to violence and power. Damn good work. And so here we have a collage of some of the images I've shown. And while they may seem disparate and non-connected, I invite you to try to find some connections of your own. For that's exactly how gender works. It's all about the connections. We are not an island. Signification only works if there's a speaker and a listener, or a viewer and a maker. As bodies in the world, and bodies who work with technology, we have a shared responsibility to create shared, intermediated, equitable worlds that don't just replicate or uphold the laws of heteronormativity or patriarchy, but reflect, represent, and promote contingency and complexity so that virtual worlds are compelling and productive for everybody. So there are 5 challenges for those of you that make. Expand your definition of narrative. I think Heidi will be on this with me. Create characters that don't just confound stereotypes but obliterate them. Stop making violence concomitant with progress in the game. Don't just speak for yourself or for your employer. Speak for the global community constantly. It's a struggle, but it's worth it. Actively seek gender parity in all labor and creation. In order to break out of the prison house of sexism, misogyny, and masculine dominance, we have to rethink how to move in and share space, to build worlds for different kinds of movements, to make room for every kind of body and position. It's entirely reasonable to be a bit reticent to engage in the discussion. A lot of it has to do with terminology. Just be compassionate and open, the way we are all about games and gaming. Gender and sexual equality, like games, are made by people who struggle towards a common goal. If you build games, you're responsible for cultural vision, how a culture sees itself and how a culture sees itself changing and how a culture sees itself potentially progressing. That is a majestic fucking gift. Do something with it. Responsible. Yeah? That's about it. Thanks, really, Ulf. Jeez. I've had to organize conferences before, and please a round of applause for Ulf, but also everybody that's participated in this and made this happen. It's a big deal. And I came here with my presentation finished, but then it changed a lot. And that was because of the conversations that I had, particularly with Adam, Sarah, Tom, Heidi, and Will. So I appreciate your due diligence and passionate advocacy. And I'm sort of contractually required to thank the Ford Foundation and the UCHRI for funding some of my research. Always got it. Thanks for the money. And that's it. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. I knew you were going to ask a question.
Well, I have to say...
That's great. That's great.
Gosh, I just have to say this talk was amazing. Like, lots of different ideas just plopping out in and out, and it's amazing. I know the talk wasn't really necessarily about this, that this is the only question that I can actually formulate, because it's just, oh yeah, and I have to say that one thing I have in Guild Wars 2 is that I completely disconnect from my body, and it takes about an hour after I stop playing the game to actually go into my body again. So it was really amazing that, it's not just me.
Well, it's a lot like travel, too.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? All of those electrons and quarks passing through your body. So half of your body is back here when you get to your destination. How long does it take to catch up?
Okay, so my question is kind of about the post-traumatic disorder. How come do you think games that are about war do not actually give people post-traumatic disorder? Is it because we go into this boy state that you talked about, that we feel like we don't have any responsibility for what we're doing in the game, while in real life we feel the responsibility? Or what do you think?
I think I have two answers for that. The first is we're so conditioned to understand war through representation, whether it's the nose cone cameras in the first Iraq War hitting their targets, or the lack of bodies that we see coming home in caskets. So that when, and particularly for these soldiers, what was really damning and really interesting is that when they came home, I asked them, are you going to continue to play America's Army? And they didn't really have an answer. It took about a month for each of them to formulate an answer, and it was usually either one of two things. The first one was, yeah, I think I'm going to play it because maybe I've heard about this new way to get over PTSD, which is sort of an immersion technique. So in the sense that it's cathartic to re-experience what that was like. And then the other half
didn't want to have anything to do with it and felt like they had been sort of existentially ripped off. Sold a bad bill of sale.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great question, thank you.
So I want to echo that. That was just amazing. But then, like we said at the pub, every word out your mouth is a weak workshop and inspiring and challenging and brilliant. The thing about identity and identity tourism and the cyborg and the thought of the, I threw back, I've read some Anton Wilson about E prime and speaking without the verb to be, because that then breaks you from that idea of rigidity. Are we looking at a change where technology and society is lagging behind, that our language structures are completely Victorian, and where we are societally is far, and are we just watching that catch up? And is this the thing that we're seeing here with gender, just clinging to the old because we're too scared to go into the new?
I think it's pretty clear that we don't have the perceptual apparatus or the cognitive apparatus to deal with digitization at this level. You can think about cell phone usage or texting or Facebook. The trick with conceiving of catching up is tough, because there's a positivism to that I think we can fall into a trap. And that's why I like Haraway's work a lot, because she's suggesting, that we co-evolve alongside it. It isn't necessarily the collision that's going to create the possibilities, it's the intermingling and the indeterminacy of that intermingling.
Because as an English Gen Xer, but not an American Gen Xer, it's true that post-humanity is my 50s shiny spaceship. It's the future that we were promised that we were never going to have because it'd be nuclear winter. And it's true, that idea of positivity through post-humanism is really alluring.
Well, yeah, I remember the Cold War too. I think it's fascinating now that there was a movie called Red Dawn. It was produced in the 80s, and it was about a Russian invasion and a group of teens in the middle of America fighting back, and they win, of course. That was just rebooted. So we're almost nostalgic for a kind of a power binary. Terrorism has ripped that apart. When we talk about indeterminacy, that's it. And that's global indeterminacy. And so often you'll see in the media too that in my country it's always the US and China. What's going to happen there? It's the new binary. So people tend to look for those patterns as a sense of comfort. And it's the same thing with gender and sexuality, obviously. So can we catch up?
Thank you.
We keep talking, I think we might.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Hello, you did awesome. I talk a lot with my friends who are also in their early 40s, and my female friends and I have come to the conclusion that there is a large group of men between the ages of 25 and 45 who are caught in this state of perpetual man-child. And I want to know, have you noticed this phenomenon? Do you agree that there's a crisis of masculinity going on with that generation? And what's your response to that? Because I'm raising 2 young boys, and I need to kind of square that somehow. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's really what I was pursuing with the concept of boyhood. The strange thing is that the regression becomes more acute the older they get, right? And it's sort of supposed to culminate in a midlife crisis. So is, my demographic, are we having a crisis of masculinity? Masculinity is always in crisis. That's the subtle truth. Each generation has a different kind of crisis. But we're discursively, we're supposed to discuss it in terms that think of any kind of indeterminacy as crisis. Because masculinity itself is supposed to be sturdy and it's supposed to be consistent. Meta-consistent. So I think my new book that I'm working on is on the other guy. which is the sort of sidekick, not the alpha male. And it turns out it's Paul Rudd. It's just Paul Rudd in every movie he's in. And I think he's a pretty good figuration of that sort of regression man-childness. Cool. Yeah, do you see it as perhaps a reaction to, let's say, feminism? Or
actually, when my friends and I have talked about it, we've noted that our parents' generation was, my grandparents were married for 50 years. They hated each other's guts, but they were married for 50 years.
Right? Stick with it.
That's right. My parents' generation was the first generation in America who decided, you know what, if we're not happy, we don't have to stay this way. And so you had an entire generation of people realizing, hey, it's okay to get a divorce. My parents were divorced. My two prior husbands, I've been married twice, both of my husband's parents were divorced. My current partner's parents are divorced. It just seems like a lot of people in my age bracket, their parents are divorced and they grew up in broken families. And that's just a coincidence we've noticed, and we've wondered if that has some bearing on it, because it seems to be a very common thing, between, from one generation to the next, there's a really big disparity in terms of, okay, this is the way families looked. Yeah. And this is the way families look now, and what effect is that starting to have? And we don't know if it's these guys are just kind of wanting to reject any of the more traditional themes of masculinity because they grew up in broken families, or we don't know. We're trying to figure it out. But we see a lot of guys our age who are, they don't want to get married and settle down. They just want to, play Xbox and drink beer and do whatever they want to do. And it's,
Well, I think the market with a capital M is selling, for people in heterosexual relationships, is selling something that is sort of destroying the core of a shared responsible relationship. And for men, it's this constant man-childness. You can always access the real you before you were stained by the woman you're with, right? And women are being sold everything. You can have it all. You can have the job, you can have the kids, and you can have a husband who will take care of the kids and help you with that load. Will that actually happen? Probably not. So yeah, I think it's the market is very good usually at sort of keeping things, when it comes to families, stable. But it's having a sort of a reverse adverse effect, I think. And a lot of that's the cult of individuality, particularly in the US.
Yep. Cool.
Yeah.
Interesting thoughts, thank you.
Good question. I think that's probably, it's close. So if you have a question, you just come and talk to me or email me or something like that. Thank you guys very much.